But let's start off with something that someone sent in. So this is Connor from New Civil Engineer. So it's about the mechanism. So he's saying, what's the likelihood we'll still see the return of effectively PFI schemes under a different name? I think I read somewhere that PF2 has been used 6 times since 2012 or something. It's sort of fizzled and gone. But you need a mechanism, don't you? You need a so Steve, first of all, what could replace it? What needs to change? We keep trying these things and they keep getting dropped.
Well, I mean, I think David referred to this. We've all really, in a sense, agreed about this proposition. What was wrong with the original PFI scheme was, first of all, the way they were constructed, where the burden of raising the finance was laid on the contractor and therefore subsequently recharged, if you like, to the public sector with some pretty eye-watering results. And secondly, was about the transfer of risk. The proposition around the original public-private partnership, which I'm old enough to remember, and for that matter I happen to know so is Steve, was that it was about taking the best of what the private sector could do and the best of what the public sector could do. Now in this, the best that the public sector can do is to actually borrow the money more cheaply than the private sector can. Now when that happens, of course, that borrowing is part of the government's overall borrowing, and therefore, will extend the point at which the Chancellor is able to balance the budget. It's interesting that there was a strong hint in this year's budget that the Chancellor is going to spend, not just this year, but probably next year and the year after, rather than close the gap in terms of our budget shortfall, because he sees that as the greater political priority. So I do not think you will see the return of PFI in the form that we know it, but as all three of us have said, that doesn't mean that there isn't the opportunity to harness private finance in road construction. The two have got to be separate.
I mean, Stephen, you gave quite a depressing reading of how long they've been trying to get this balance right. And what role can the private companies, for example, David, I'll ask you this as well, have in saying, well, why don't we do it this way? Why don't we do it? Is everyone leaving it to the government to come up with a new structure? Are the private companies lobbying to do the same? We want it in a certain way?
I think, as Steve has kindly pointed out, I've been party to wrestling with this for about 30 years, all told now. And I think it is a mistake if anyone is thinking that the only person in the room that can come up with a proposal is government itself. And I think what I read into the Chancellor's, what he was saying on Monday, is there is an open mind to proposals, but I think the answer to this question is, it's in this question of the name. If what we're talking about is private finance and simply the raising of money is all we're talking about, which, as Steve has said, the government can do. We can do that, we can do it cheaper than anyone else. It can't just be that. What it has to be is something that we're hearing from David, which is, if I, the private sector, can give you a better package, which has a better contractual structure, a better involvement of the supply chain in the design and delivery of the project, and coincidentally, and part of the incentive on us to do that well is that we will bring the money to the table, that will be the sort of thing I think the Chancellor would go for.
David, what do you think the private companies can give that, if the government goes out and borrows the money separately, it can't achieve?
Yeah, I was just thinking when Steve was talking there, that there's probably an example out there at the moment which people are trying to get their head around, and we're actually involved with some of the planning of, is sort of the Oxford-Cambridge arc. And you look at that, so here's a corridor, requires good transport links, road, rail, plans to build million homes, linking, 3 cities, Milton Keynes and, Oxford and Cambridge. And you look at that and where's the conversation right now with the private sector to saying, look, you guys build the road, there's a lot of value capture, there's land, there's all sorts of conversations about alternative income streams for investors to get a return on what they're putting into it in terms of a piece of transport infrastructure. So it comes back to that, real engagement early. How can you bring even they're going to work closely with the other transport infrastructure classes and things like rail as well. It's not just the road, it's how it interfaces with that, how you can then build homes and create place. All of that can create a stream of revenue and a benefit which can be unlocked from the highways, of which the private sector can certainly get involved with and be innovative in approach to both the delivery and part of the finance.
Steve, you have a lot to deal with people, investors from different countries. Is there somewhere that does it well that you have seen?
Yes, but that's where there's a much more liberal view of reward and payment, if you like. So, for example, in the States, far more highway is constructed entirely through private finance and therefore repaid through private finance, and charges reflect what the operator believes they can ultimately get out of the audience. It's easier to do when you have much longer route savings. I mean, it's always been the classic case, for example, that the French autoroute system is the one you will automatically use to go into the city because the time savings is so much greater than the N roads rather, and in the States that tends to be true as well. One of the issues is that the pension funds who appear to be willing to invest in our infrastructure tend to be foreign pension funds. They're Canadian, US, Japanese, some Chinese. These are the people who say, we don't mind a bit of risk. We don't mind, because that gives us a 3% return rather than, taking zero risk at about 1.5%. They're prepared to do it, but our issue is that we have to overcome the kind of issues that, again, we've all talked about: legislative risk. How much of that are you prepared to accept? Construction risk. Now, to me, anybody in this room who's involved in construction will understand that every time they tender for a job, they're having to take a risk on construction. You want to know where companies fail, again, we all know this, it's where you're bidding close to zero margin and trying to make it on the claims. And I mean, that's where this industry is in a race to the bottom, and sooner or later it's got to stop. But these sorts of risks are the ones that actually have tended to put foreign investors off the UK, and they are capable, in fact, in my view, of being overcome. I think there is a market there, and actually, I'm not an advocate for road user charging because I want to poke motorists in the eye. I'm simply one of those who believes that as the way we fund the road system now disappears, the Treasury will require us to find some alternative, and that actually there are lots of advantages of road user charging, one of which is that you've got an inbuilt mechanism to allow a private contractor to get the return straightforwardly right back to them, to, with a cap and collar, to allow them to obtain the reward on their investment. I think it can be done.
Okay, you've raised the spectre of road charging. I'm sure Tony Blair loved it, didn't he? It didn't go so well for him. Someone's put a question up here, again, anonymous. How do we make the road user view itself as a customer, okay, and therefore more receptive to paying for a better product? So I suppose, effectively, how do you persuade people that they should basically pay for this, and then you don't get 1 million people signing, petitions saying we don't want, it's worse than the poll tax kind of thing. How do you avoid that, Stephen?
It's very hard. I seem to be saying that a lot this afternoon.
Yeah.
I took that petition very personally at the time. So at the moment, I don't think that as we step out of our front doors in the morning, we think about the roads as a utility service. And one of the reasons for that is, if we take a comparison with water, water is really easy because the regulator requires essentially two things on your behalf. One is that when you turn the tap, water comes out at a sufficient pressure. And the other is it's what's called in industry potable, which means you can drink it. And that's pretty much it. Then there's a whole lot of back office stuff that the regulator takes an interest in about the efficiency with which it's delivered. But as far as the consumer is concerned, it's pretty clear cut. What I want is water when the tap's turned, and I want to be able to drink it. Trying to come up with the equivalent measure of, well, what do you want from the road then? It's a lot harder, because I think many of us would instinctively start by saying, well, I want to get to complete my journey in the time I expect. I want to get there, and I want the road to be nice and flat, and then we'll start adding, and ultimately we end up with quite a complicated matrix, and it all just falls down again. Now, I think that where the road investment strategy is leading the way is in saying, government setting for Highways England, here's your money, here's what we want. So there is a quite clear performance specification. It's not quite in the format that you would give to a member of the public with their utility bill, but it's a step in the direction because it's saying, we'll tell you what we want from the network. We'll tell you in terms of lane availability, in terms of clearing up incidents, and if we could take that thinking and take it a step further onto the local roads as well, then we might be getting somewhere.
This might be a stupid question, but with road charging, does it always have to be someone driving up to a toll booth and paying, and therefore it's quite a spontaneous decision? Or could you pay a monthly? Is there a way of doing it where you basically sweeten the pill a little bit?
When Rod Eddington did his great survey of the UK transport scene, if you remember, he touched on road pricing, and he estimated the capital cost of introducing it at the time as a delta between 1 and 20 billion. In other words, he didn't have a clue, but he knew it would be an awful lot of money. And that's because if you did have a system run on gantries and maybe AMPR, it would cost billions to install, and that the first thing you'd have to do is to recover that cost. Treasury wouldn't find that attractive at all. But these days, of course, with the smart phone, the smart car, the smart city, the irony is that you're probably going to get in your next car the kind of kit that would enable a charging system to operate, tracking, using AMPR to take out non-conformers, of course, to identify non-conformers, but essentially doing it at very, very little capital cost. And incidentally, can you do it? It's interesting, the American state of Oregon reached a crisis in terms of, in the States, a lot of taxes are hypothecated, and in their case, they said, the amount we're getting out of our road fuel tax just isn't enough to keep Oregon's many roads, it's almost a road-only kind of state, in good condition. We're going to have to move to road user charging. The key was how well they explained it to the population. One of the reasons people don't want road user charging is, as I said, they see it as just another way for the government to stick their hand in your pocket. When people in Manchester were asked whether they wanted it in return, after London, of course, had got it through my old friend Ken Livingstone, they said, bugger off. We don't want you sticking your hand in our pocket. We're quite happy. You'll give us the money anyway. When Oregon simply laid it out, said, this is what it is, you won't be paying fuel duty, you will be paying instead a charge of so much per mile, they found that it's not as easy as just one meeting, but over time, the citizens of that state have come to accept it. It's now almost universal in Oregon. And I just think there are ways in which it would happen. It wouldn't be quick, it would take time to do, but this is, it's very straightforward economics. You're going to pay for it some way, you might as well at least pay for use, like we do with so many other things.
David, you've talked about sort of selling the idea to companies. Who should be doing that? Should it be the government? Should it be local mayors? Should it be subnational transport body? Who should be doing this selling? And what is the key benefit? Because I think one of the issues that I don't think we've quite touched on, but is prediction, isn't it? If you're going to say to someone, this number of cars will use the road, and then they don't, this sort of shadow toll thing, then who loses the money? So who should be doing that selling point, and what are the key selling points they should be singing about?
In terms of promoting the projects
persuading private companies to invest in a scheme.
It quite certainly has to start with government. Absolutely, and I think it comes, but it starts with government in terms of laying out the overall objectives and what it is in its broadest sense that people are trying to achieve and what we're trying to achieve as a nation and the rest. And then, as I mentioned before, it is then bringing in early private sector engagement to then identify what are the potential opportunities and spin-offs for those. Because at the moment, you can't really just separate the two. I think, it really does need the two working very, very close hand in hand together.
We've got a question here. So it says, with the lack of transparency on real operational cost of publicly funded projects compared to the numerous reports on PFIs, can benefits of PPP be shown? So I guess effectively, again, it's a sales job, isn't it? It's saying people aren't getting the data and the figures.
Can I just pick up on that? Because
Yeah.
I mean, you start to move in a really broad conversation about data and who owns data. I mean, I think the answer to that is absolutely, we need to have data transparency. People need to know, and it comes down to the risk, and can you quantify the risk? Having absolute quantifiable risk, and then you can have sensible conversations about it. When bids go in, looking at private, people are having a punt. They're having they're taking a gamble. Some of them are saying, well, I think there's such and such chance of that happening, and I'm going to punt it that way, and I'm going to look at various things. The more you get more certainty in terms of real costs that are in, whether that's in the cost of construction, whether that's in the cost of operation, whether it's in the cost of finance, and all of that's laid bare to people. People then are really starting to drive innovation around, so once we have all of that, how can we do something smarter, better than anybody else? I think, to me, and there's a broad industry conversation about data and who owns data and all the rest of it, our industry would be a lot better off if we can get our heads around this, about who owns the data and making data accessible to everybody.
What are the chances of getting that kind of transparency? Because as a journalist, I know I have the experience of everything's fine, and suddenly they tell you it wasn't fine after all, projects get delayed, they announce an overspend on a busy news day. It all looks a little bit cloak and dagger from the outside perspective. So no one's really going to want to stand up and say, do you know what? Crossrail's going to take us 6 months, a year longer to build than we thought and cost this much extra, or the Olympics, or whatever it is. It's not really going to happen, is it? Governments aren't really going to...
Well, nobody likes to be the bearer of bad news, whether it's a delay on a rail scheme or a problem with a road scheme. But what I would say in response to the question is there is definitely an issue about how many different numbers that you pitch into the equation and where you get the data from. But there are two numbers in particular, I guess, two aspects to it which are particularly difficult. One is, I'm very fond of saying this, people will have heard me say it before, that the only thing you can say with absolute certainty about the future is that it hasn't happened yet. And being absolutely certain about what's going to happen in 5, 10 or 50-year concession for the M6 toll, formerly the Birmingham Northern Reef Road, is very, very hard. And the second one, I can say with confidence, having spent an enjoyable afternoon with the Public Accounts Committee some time ago, is to be able to explain why it is you think that the incentive on a private contractor through raising money themselves is worth the premium it costs you, because it costs them more money to borrow money than it does you. And that's something of a tenet of faith. It can be proved to an extent by looking at other projects and saying this is how it worked, but there are some, and quite possibly some future transport ministers, who will be quite hard to persuade that you couldn't get the same efficiency simply by managing the projects better yourself.
Has anyone got any questions from the floor? By the way, if you have, put your hand up and we can get a microphone to you, or have a little think about it and come to it after this. Stephen and Steve, I guess, what are we talking about here? You touched on it. Is this new roads? Is this investment in sort of autonomous vehicle technology? Is this investment in charging points? Is it right to be talking about this in terms of roads, or should we be thinking way beyond that? Because presumably some of this revolution we keep hearing about could mean that people are travelling in far more public transport, for example, or shared transport.
I think it makes sense to think about both tiers in a sense. So we've got a lot of infrastructure to look after, both Highways England, but the 97 or 98% of local roads that also need investment to keep them in good order. So we should be thinking, how can we best raise the money that's going to be needed to maintain them and to add some of the technology that will make them work better. But thinking, if you like, more broadly at the transport offer, I think it's interesting to note you asked about road charging and whether it could be something that isn't about toll booths and gantries. Anyone in the room who's taken an Uber has been exposed to a form of road pricing, because Uber vary their charges according to demand. So here's a wholly private company we're not going to get into some of their questions about their business model, that there are going to be opportunities for private companies coming into the transport service market, which probably even today we're not quite seeing, but some clever folk out there are probably thinking even now of big opportunities for them.
Steve, do you think that's where the bigger opportunities are necessarily, in that technology, rather than in building a road and getting money back over time?
Yes. I mean, that's precisely where I think the larger opportunities are. But I just sort of would underline it with one point, which is that there's much talk about, the age of austerity that we've been through, and this is not actually a political point. It's just a statement of fact. Austerity, you would assume, meant that the government was spending less. Now, you, as having done the job you've done for the last 6 years in transport, will know that actually in every single one of the last 20 years, the government has actually spent more money than the previous year. And the reason I make that point is only that there will always be an opportunity for government to allow the private sector to build, to create, to operate, to manage, where there's a clear ability to transfer risk, where the risk can be appropriate to the reward and the taxpayer is relieved of the burden. And are we doing it already? Well, I think, as Steve says, we're already doing it. The smartphone in our pockets is the opportunity that many contractors have already, particularly in the field of personal mobility, to tax us effectively for use. It's a smartphone equivalent of a taxi. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm more interested in how we can actually have the road capacity that we need. And as I say, Jim's, RIS2 is exciting, but nonetheless, we all know we could spend more, and you only have to talk to local authorities to understand that. How can we create a mechanism which allows a pension fund to invest in a road scheme where the risk is in the appropriate place and the reward is reasonably predictable? I heard the other day that Legal & General had actually funded a road scheme which, by its nature, then created an area where housing could happen. Housing couldn't happen without the road link. Pretty much the sort of thing you get in Barking Reach in London, where everybody knew you could build 20,000 homes, but you needed rail connectivity to get there. And Legal & General's reward is per dwelling. In other words, for every house that's built, they get a click. They've said, we'll happily put the infrastructure in, because that reward is not through road tolling, but it is a reward. They were able to assess the cost, they took a view on the risk, they could see what the reward was, they said that's an investment we're prepared to make. Now, that kind of creative thinking is what we need more of, so that we can get the private sector involved and financing, but where we don't see the kind of really expensive, I think, scandals that we saw in early PFI, because some of those will be with us for generations, not me, my children, my children's children more likely will still be picking up the cost of those. That ain't going to happen again for sure.
You raise a really interesting point. David, is this all about big schemes and big tolls, or actually is this some way of getting private money filling potholes, for example, which we get more emails about, basically on the BBC, than anything else when we cover transport stories?
Yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting piece about your question about the technology, and one area that we haven't touched on, and two Steves would probably know a lot more about it than I do, which is about asset recycling. Some of the things they've done in Australia, I think they, through asset recycling, which is where, private sector buying an existing asset, there was 30 billion injected, and there's 80 billion now, this is Australian dollars, being now reinvested in other areas, and you can control that investment to target places where you want that to be. It could be potholes, it could be technology, and the like. So, I think there certainly are, the private sector would be interested in looking at particular assets as they are now. How can you take that asset on, and at what cost do you take that asset on? Then what is the return you get for the improvement on that asset? And some of that improvement is not just potholes, but it's the technology. It's using different roads usage, it's different vehicles, all those types of things, which again engender some innovative thinking and the rest of it to get a better return on that existing asset.
I wanted to quickly ask you about the rail project you're involved in, which is privately funded, or it's a proposal at the moment. How simple has that process been? Broad, you don't have to give details, but
We were talking about our
The
rail
Heathrow
projects.
Southern project.
I thought you were asking me
Well,
about
well, I'll give you a
Heathrow,
classic
you've got one,
example, Richard, of the way we used to procure underground rolling stock. Essentially, when we bought it from the manufacturers, we got a warranty which was slightly less good than you'd get on a Skoda. I mean, basically, once it was out of the factory, it was down to Transport for London, or in those days, London Regional Transport, to maintain it. And the quality, frankly, was, let's put it this way, variable. And one of the things I did when I was minister was to supervise the first example of where we said to the manufacturer, you finance these trains, 98 sets, we'll rent them from you, and every day that they work, we'll pay you. And if they all work, we'll pay you a bonus. But if they don't work, if 1, 2, 3, 4, or 10 aren't capable of operating, then we won't be paying you. And beyond a certain point, we'll even be penalising you. We transferred 5,000 maintenance workers to the private contractor. Private contractor went out, raised the money. We're talking of these very, very large rail companies. And those rolling stock sets are the most reliable on the system. Because D, B, F, and O, they had to not just build it, they had to operate it. And therefore, guess what? They were a bit more careful about the way they made it. You know, when you use the private sector possibly, when you use private sector financing properly, the public sector gets a huge benefit from it. This is not just about a different checkbook. It's about transferring risk in the way that optimizes the benefit to the taxpayer. That's when it works, and that's why, frankly, it can still work in the road system.
I'm going to go along the... Was there a question from the floor before I come to the last point I want to make? We're going to go along the row here. Just quickly, Stephen, starting with you. Is this the wrong time to be doing it because no one knows what's going to happen with Brexit? We don't really know what a Labour government would do. Politically, it all feels a little bit up in the air at the moment. No one's really going to invest at this point, are they?
Well, I think that it is an uncertain climate, and I think that there are huge changes going on in the world of transport and motoring in particular. That said, there are things that need doing, and I personally will be quite surprised if we don't find that there is some form of private investment helping the Lower Thames crossing to go ahead by the time it goes ahead.
Right. David, what's the climate like for you guys out there at the moment?
Well, I mean, things like Lower Thames Crossing are there, and of course there's Silvertown Tunnel, which is still moving ahead, which is, private, has private funding associated with it. Then there's the stuff on the rail side we were talking about, and the market-led proposals which government has put out on the rail side. So, there is some areas that you can see, but is the time right? It's always a good time to be talking about it, and it's always a good time to be promoting about it. This government is reaching out. Steve started off, and Steve mentioned too. They are talking to us. They're talking to us a lot, to the private sector. They see the importance of the partnership with the private sector. So I just think right now we need to be just keep having those conversations and keep moving those conversations along.
We had a good budget, confident budget for roads, but there is uncertainty out there. We've got a spending review coming up, which everyone's getting quite itchy about. How confident are you that the money will be there in a year's time?
Oh, I think to be fair, whether it's the control period in the railway or RIS periods with Highways England, government has eventually come round to the view that stability in funding, forward stability, is worth a lot. When I was a minister, and Steve and I were both in the department at the same time, I can tell you that we never knew from one year to the next what our capital allocation would be, and as a result, we spent it suboptimally. The great thing is, yes, we've got the review and so on, and we can't necessarily guarantee that funding will be available at the same level in perpetuity, but the great success of control periods and RIS periods is precisely at least the predictability of funding. Now we've got to make sure that the predictability of funding is matched by the predictability of delivery, which hasn't necessarily been the case, frankly, in roads, wasn't absolutely the case in RIS 1, but looks as if it's improving hugely under Jim's leadership. hopefully better in RIS2. Only one final point I wanted to make, because David mentioned the Silvertown tunnel crossing, which of course with the existing Blackwall crossings will also be tolled. The irony is that there, the toll was agreed as part of the concession to protesters who didn't like the idea of more road traffic, and was introduced precisely to deter people from using it. You can use tolls in all sorts of ways, not just to encourage, occasionally to deter.
That's a great note to leave it. Thank you for such stimulating conversation. Thanks to Mott MacDonald as well for sponsoring this session. We're back at 4 looking at mobility in cities. So it's the cutting congestion, improving air, how we're all going to be moving around in the future. But for now, please thank our panel.